The room fell silent the moment Thomas stepped forward with a velvet box in his hands. Everyone's eyes followed him, his proud, beaming mother sitting at the head of the long table, his relatives clapping and whispering, the chandelier light sparkling on the expensive glasses of champagne. Corinne's heart pounded against her chest as she stood at his side, forcing a smile that felt brittle on her lips. She had spent the last week hearing Thomas speak in half sentences about the perfect gift, something that will make her proud, something that will change everything. He had looked at her with that soft, reassuring smile that he always used when he wanted her to trust him. She remembered the way he placed his hand on hers 2 nights ago, whispering, "You'll see, Corinne. Mom will finally see what a perfect daughter-in-law you are." And now, here they were. The birthday celebration of his mother, a woman who had never hidden her coldness toward her. A celebration so extravagant, so polished, that even their wedding had seemed modest in comparison. Crystal chandeliers, musicians in the corner playing a soft waltz, waiters gliding between tables like shadows, and the constant echo of laughter and polite applause. Thomas cleared his throat, his voice warm, full of pride. "Mother," he said, turning to the elegant, sharp-eyed woman whose smile had always been carved in ice whenever she looked at Corinne, "I thought long and hard about what to give you this year, something that would bring you real joy." Corinne straightened, her fingers tightening around her clutch. She remembered his words, something that will bring her joy, and tried to convince herself it would be something kind, something that would finally bridge the cold gap between her and this family. Jewelry, maybe. A vacation. Something harmless. Thomas handed the box to his mother, and she opened it slowly, deliberately, her perfectly manicured fingers pulling out not a necklace, not a bracelet, but a single folded document. The room seemed to exhale in confusion as she unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning it. And then she smiled. For the first time in years, she truly smiled wide, triumphant, victorious. "A divorce certificate," she announced, her voice slicing through the air like a blade. "From my son divorcing Corinne." There was laughter. Actual laughter from some of the relatives, soft gasps from others, and the sound of Corinne's world collapsing around her. Her breath caught in her throat as her vision blurred. She stared at Thomas, her husband, the man who only yesterday kissed her forehead and promised her a future, and all she could see was betrayal dressed in a suit and tie. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, maybe even relieved. The room spun for a moment. The clinking of glasses felt like daggers in her ears. The birthday song started in the background, awkwardly trying to continue the celebration as though nothing had happened. Corinne turned on her heel and left. No words, no tears yet, just a cold, mechanical walk past the tables, past the curious stares, past the whispers. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the night air. It was cold, but her skin burned. She couldn't remember how long she walked. The city lights blurred past her as her thoughts raced. Divorce, just like that? After all the compromises, the nights she stayed awake by his side, the moments she defended him even when his own decisions made little sense. She remembered the early days when they met. Thomas had been charming, ambitious, full of promises. His mother had been the only shadow, disapproving, dismissive, always finding a reason to belittle her. And now it made sense. This had been their plan all along, hadn't it? Build her up, marry her, let her believe she belonged, and then rip the ground from under her feet in the most humiliating way possible. She reached their apartment hours later. Empty, silent. He was still at the party, no doubt basking in his mother's praise, the obedient son who delivered her the greatest gift, his wife's humiliation. Corinne dropped her clutch on the sofa and stared at the walls. Her reflection in the window stared back, tired eyes, makeup smeared, hair falling loose from the elegant twist she had worn. 26, and already discarded like an unwanted ornament. The next morning, Thomas came home. No apology, no explanation, just a casual, "You weren't supposed to leave like that, Corinne, you embarrassed me." Embarrassed him. Her hands clenched so hard her nails dug into her palms. "Embarrassed you," she repeated, her voice shaking. "You handed your mother our divorce like it was a birthday card, Thomas. What exactly did you expect me to do? Sing along to the cake song?" He shrugged. "It's better this way. You've always been difficult for her, for us." For us, the words lingered like poison. She didn't scream. Not then. Not in that moment. Instead, something inside her went still, like a frozen lake under a dark sky. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man who would never fight for her, who would always bow to the cold throne his mother sat upon. And in that stillness, a seed was planted. Revenge. It didn't come as a flash of fury. It came as a slow, deliberate burn curling around her ribs, feeding on the humiliation that had been served to her like dessert at that party. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat by the window, the city still humming below, and started to think. Plans didn't need to be loud. They needed to be patient. Thomas had taken her dignity in front of his family. His mother had celebrated her ruin. Now she would take something from him. Not just something, everything that made him feel secure, untouchable, praised. Over the next days, she listened, observed. Thomas spoke freely now, as though the divorce paper had erased her presence, as though she was already gone. He talked about the business deals he was closing, the properties under his name, the fragile alliances he had with people who admired his charm but knew little of his spine. And Karen smiled. She smiled when he left in the mornings, smiled when he complained about little things, smiled when he spoke to his mother in hushed, secretive tones in the hallway. She knew where to start. But before the plan could begin, she replayed that night again and again in her mind. The room, the velvet box, the document, the way his mother's fingers tightened on it like a trophy. Every time she pictured it, her resolve hardened. They had taken her down in front of the world they valued, status, money, image. So that would be the arena she would strike. Not with tears, not with begging, with precision. Days turned to a week. Thomas grew distant, already making arrangements. Papers to sign, lawyers to contact, accounts to divide. He thought she was broken. He thought she was silent because she had accepted it. And that was his mistake. On the 7th night, Karen stood before the mirror. Her reflection no longer looked lost. Her eyes were clear, sharp, and the faintest curve of a plan danced at the edge of her lips. The birthday gift that was supposed to break her had only sculpted her into something stronger, colder, more deliberate. "Happy birthday, mother-in-law," she whispered into the empty apartment. "Enjoy your gift while it lasts." The days after that cursed birthday unfolded with a strange, quiet rhythm. Thomas moved through the apartment as though it no longer belonged to her, leaving his cufflinks on the counter, speaking on the phone in the living room without lowering his voice, locking his laptop only when she entered the room. Karen played her role well. Calm, almost indifferent, no accusations, no tears. That was the first rule she set for herself. Never let him know he had broken her. Let him believe she was fading into the background, like wallpaper that had lost its color. She learned quickly that Thomas's confidence made him careless. He had always been arrogant, but now that he believed she was no longer a threat, he began to reveal more than he should. She learned the names of his partners, the ones he was desperately trying to impress to secure a lucrative development project. She listened as he boasted to his mother over the phone about the upcoming deal, how it would cement his position and finally earn her approval as a son who was not only obedient but also successful. The irony made Karen's lips twitch in a bitter smile. Approval. Always chasing it, always offering pieces of himself to that cold woman who had orchestrated her humiliation. Karen began with small steps. She opened a forgotten email account of hers, one Thomas never paid attention to. From there, she reached out to a former colleague, Claire, a sharp-minded woman who had once worked in the same financial firm Karen left after marrying Thomas. They met for coffee under the guise of catching up, but Karen's questions were calculated. Claire knew people, lawyers, brokers, investigators. "You're awfully curious about property transfers these days," Claire teased, sipping her cappuccino. Karen smiled, feigning casual interest. "Just planning ahead. You never know when life changes." At night, while Thomas slept beside her with the steady, untroubled breathing of a man who believed the world was under his control, Karen would slip from the bed and sit at the kitchen table with her laptop. She mapped out everything: his business structure, the properties registered in both their names, the accounts he had kept separate but used shared funds to maintain. Every line, every signature was a thread, and she began to see how they connected. But her revenge was not to be rushed. That was the second rule she whispered to herself. Patience is a weapon. The humiliation she had suffered was public, grand, orchestrated in front of a crowd. Her retaliation had to match its scale, not just to hurt, but to echo. Her first real move came quietly. One morning, as Thomas left for a meeting, she placed a discreet call to one of Claire's contacts, a discreet investigator named Mason, a man with no moral compass but an impressive network. She gave him a name, Thomas's main investor, a man known for being ruthlessly clean in his deals. "I need everything you can find," she said, "especially anything that connects him to my husband's project." Mason didn't ask why. Money talked, and Karen had access to enough of it for now. Over the next weeks, Karen perfected the art of pretense. She prepared Thomas's favorite meals, asked about his meetings, even accompanied him to one or two social events where they played the role of the civilized, soon-to-be-divorced couple. "It's so good you two are keeping it amicable," people said. "You're both so mature." Karen smiled each time, her eyes flicking toward Thomas, who nodded proudly, as if orchestrating a civilized separation made him a better man. In reality, he was already slipping. Mason's updates came in fragments, delivered in encrypted emails and brief calls. There were gaps in the investor's records, shady transfers that Thomas seemed either unaware of or complicit in. There were also whispers, rumors that the project he was pushing so hard for wasn't as secure as he had painted it. If those whispers became loud enough, Thomas would be left holding the blame. Karen didn't want to destroy him instantly. No, that would be mercy. She wanted to unravel him thread by thread, until even his mother, the woman who had clutched that divorce certificate like a crown jewel, would see him for what he was: weak, dependent, disposable. The first tangible crack appeared one Thursday evening. Thomas came home late, his tie loosened, his voice tight with irritation. "Something off with the investors," he muttered, packing. "They're hesitating, pulling back, someone's feeding them doubts." Karen, curled up on the sofa with a book, looked up with soft, curious eyes. "That sounds serious," she murmured. "Is there anything I can do to help?" He glanced at her, suspicious for a moment, then shook his head. "No, just stay out of it." She did, outwardly. But that night, while he drowned his frustration in a glass of scotch, she sent another message to Mason. "They're getting nervous. Make sure they stay that way." It was intoxicating, in a way she hadn't expected. Not the destruction itself, but the power of control after being stripped of it so brutally. For weeks she had been a pawn, shuffled and discarded. Now she was moving the pieces. Still, Karen knew there was a risk in moving too quickly. Thomas's mother watched everything. That woman had a nose for weakness and betrayal. She had built her own empire on it. Karen kept her distance, never calling, never provoking. But once, while walking past an upscale boutique, she saw her across the street, smiling, laughing with a friend, wearing the same diamond brooch she had worn the night of that party. It made Karen stop in her tracks. That image burned into her mind, fueling the cold flame in her chest. You will lose him, too, she thought, just not in the way you expect. 2 months into her silent campaign, Thomas started to notice the tension building around him. Calls grew sharper, meetings more frequent, nights longer. He began sleeping in the guest room, saying it was just easier while things are busy. Karen said nothing. She prepared coffee for him in the morning, ironed his shirts, and collected fragments, names, dates, accounts like pearls on a string. Then came the night of the gala. It was a charity event, one his mother insisted they both attend to keep up appearances. Karen dressed carefully, a sleek black dress, understated jewelry, her hair cascading over one shoulder. She looked every inch the graceful, soon-to-be ex-wife. Thomas's mother greeted her with the same thin-lipped smile she had worn since the first day they met. "Still here, Karen," she said quietly, almost kindly, as they posed for a photo. Karen smiled back, her voice smooth as silk. "Of course, I wouldn't miss an evening celebrating family." That night she saw what she needed. The investor, nervous, glancing at Thomas with tight smiles, whispered to another guest about inconsistencies. His wife mentioned, over champagne, how these kinds of scandals can ruin a name overnight. Karen filed it away. It was almost ready. When they returned home, Thomas collapsed into a chair, rubbing his temples. "I don't understand why everything's slipping," he muttered. Karen poured him a drink, handed it to him, and for the first time in weeks touched his shoulder. "You've been working so hard," she said softly. "Sometimes when you push too fast, things break." He looked up at her then, maybe for the first time since that birthday night, really looked. "You're handling this well," he said, a note of suspicion in his voice. "Almost too well." She smiled. "Would you rather I screamed?" He didn't answer, but the seed of doubt had been planted in him now, just as it once had been planted in her. Later, when the apartment was quiet again, Karen sat at her laptop, staring at the web of connections she had built. Thomas was standing on a glass bridge, and she had already started to tap on the cracks. The final step wasn't here yet, but it was coming. Soon, the world that had applauded her humiliation would watch his. Karen sat in her small living room, arms crossed, staring out the window where a cold rain traced jagged lines down the glass. The wind rattled the shutters, as if echoing the storm inside her. Ever since that night, since Thomas, her husband, had handed his mother that gift wrapped in cruelty, the divorce papers that made the crowd cheer, there had been a hollow ache in her chest. At first it was pain. Sharp, searing, humiliating pain, the kind that makes your breath catch and your eyes burn even when you refuse to cry. The guests had clapped, the music had played, his mother had smiled like a queen who finally got her wish. And Karen had stood there, stripped of dignity, while her marriage was turned into a performance. But after the pain came something else, something colder, clearer, a kind of calm fury that settled in her veins like ice. She was not going to beg, she was not going to crumble, she was going to rise. Thomas thought he had won that night. He thought a public humiliation would break her down into silence, that she would vanish quietly into the background while he carried on with his grand gestures for his mother. But he didn't know Karen as well as he believed. He had mistaken kindness for weakness. He had confused patience with passivity, and that was his first mistake. The second mistake was even bigger. He underestimated what a woman like her could do when she had nothing left to lose. The first step of her revenge was silence. She didn't scream, didn't demand explanations, didn't throw his clothes out of the closet. She smiled faintly when they returned home that night and said she needed some time alone. She cooked breakfast the next morning as though nothing had happened. She sent polite messages to his mother, thanking her for the lovely evening. It disarmed them both. Thomas thought she was defeated. His mother thought she was harmless. That illusion was worth more than any weapon. Karen bought a small leather-bound notebook, one she used to fill with recipes and household notes. Now, on the very first page in bold letters she wrote, "Plan for retribution." Below that, the date she stopped being their victim. She began with information. Thomas's business was not as untouchable as he liked to pretend. It was built on a fragile network of trust, partners, investors, two key suppliers who kept the whole machine running. And Karen, after years of being the invisible wife, had heard more than anyone suspected. Pillow talk, careless phone calls on speaker, open laptops on the kitchen table while he poured himself another glass of whiskey. She had been there, quiet and unnoticed, while the pieces revealed themselves. She started making calls, not reckless ones, subtle, probing conversations under the pretense of concern. "I just wanted to check in," she would say. "Thomas has been so stressed lately. Are things stable on your side?" Some partners opened up. One hinted at delayed payments. Another complained about Thomas ignoring their last proposal. It was nothing damning yet, but it was a thread. And Karen had always been good at pulling threads until the whole thing unraveled. Meanwhile, she rebuilt her own image. She started posting again on social media, not the quiet, obedient wife, but a poised, professional woman with ambition in her eyes. A networking brunch here, a charity gala there. Old acquaintances, ones Thomas had told her to avoid because they were a bad influence, started showing up in her messages again. A lawyer friend offered her advice, just in case. A former colleague hinted at a project that could use her expertise. The world, it turned out, had not forgotten Karen. It had just been waiting for her to step back into it. 2 weeks after the birthday humiliation, Thomas began to notice the distance. He came home one evening, loosening his tie, expecting dinner as usual, and found the table empty and the lights dim. Karen emerged from the study, impeccably dressed, her makeup flawless, a faint smile on her lips. "Where were you?" he asked, not quite hiding the irritation in his voice. "Meeting an old friend," she replied smoothly. "She runs a consultancy firm now. We were discussing potential collaborations." He frowned. "Since when do you?" "Since now," she interrupted gently. You made it clear I don't belong in your life anymore, Thomas, so I'm finding a place in my own. The words stung more than he let show. But Thomas, prideful as ever, dismissed it with a scoff and poured himself a drink. Karen watched him, and in that moment she realized something important. Revenge wasn't always about the grand gesture. It was about the slow shift of power, 1 inch at a time. She had also started leaving small traces for his mother to find. Not direct accusations. Oh no, that would be too obvious, but hints. A missing invoice here, a casual remark to a neighbor about Thomas's recent troubles at work. Within days, the older woman's calls to Thomas became more frequent, her tone sharper. "Is everything all right with your contracts?" she asked one evening on speakerphone. Karen sat across the room, pretending not to listen, a book in her hands. "You've seemed distracted." "I've got it handled," Thomas muttered, rubbing his temple. Karen smiled to herself. Good, she thought. Let her worry. Let her start to doubt. By the third week, Karen's plan had moved to its second phase. She wasn't going to ruin him with rumors alone. No, she was going to make him ruin himself. That meant creating just the right conditions: financial pressure, emotional instability, the feeling that everyone was watching him stumble. She reached out to one of the investors she knew had a shaky relationship with Thomas. Over coffee in a quiet cafe, she leaned forward and lowered her voice. "I'm concerned," she said softly. "Thomas has been making decisions without consulting the board lately, risky ones. And after what happened at the birthday celebration, well, I'm not sure his judgment is as clear as it used to be." The investor frowned. "You think he's distracted?" "I think," Karen said, "he's about to make a very costly mistake." She didn't have to say more. Seeds, once planted, grow on their own. At night, she would sit at her desk, the rain tapping against the window, and review her notes. Dates, names, subtle pressure points. She wasn't just planning revenge anymore. She was shaping a narrative where she would emerge not as the scorned wife, but as the survivor. The one who rose from public humiliation to undeniable power. And yet, beneath it all, there was still that ember of hurt. The image of that night. The clinking glasses, the forced smiles, the way her hands had trembled as the guests whispered behind their champagne flutes. It fueled her, but it also warned her. She couldn't let this turn her into them. Her revenge had to be precise, surgical, not a blind firestorm. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Thomas was preparing a presentation for a potential merger, one that could stabilize his fragile finances. Karen offered to help, as she always had. "You know I have a knack for catching errors," she said sweetly. He, still arrogant, handed over the drafts without a second thought. That night, she found exactly what she needed: a discrepancy in the projections, a hidden clause that would expose him if brought to light at the wrong moment. She didn't change it. Not yet. She simply copied the document, tucked it safely into her folder, and let him proceed. By the time the deal was set to be announced, Karen was already 3 steps ahead. She had booked a quiet dinner with the same investor she had met weeks before. She arranged a charity gala appearance for herself on the same night as the announcement. She even sent his mother flowers with a card. "Thank you for the unforgettable birthday. I've learned so much since then." The message was subtle, but it burned. Thomas didn't see it coming. How could he? In his mind, she was still the girl who smiled through humiliation, who apologized when she wasn't wrong, who set the table and kept her voice down. But that Karen had walked out of the banquet hall that night and never returned. The rain eased outside the window as Karen closed her notebook for the evening. Tomorrow would bring the next step. Tomorrow, the first domino would fall. She allowed herself one last thought before bed, a whisper in the dark. "You should have never given her that gift, Thomas, because now I'm the one unwrapping the real surprise. Would you like me to now?" One Right Chapter 4, Final. The climax and full revenge, 2,500 words. 2. Or first create a short summary of Chapter 4 with hooks, so you can see the plan. 3. Or make this chapter even more hook-packed in the first minute, like your competitors. Which way should we go? The city's skyline shimmered under a pale dawn, streaks of gold breaking through the fatting night. Karen woke early, long before Thomas stirred in the bedroom they still, technically, shared. Today was the day, the culmination of weeks of careful planning, patient manipulation, and a kind of cold, deliberate resolve she had never known she possessed. The dominoes were lined up. All it would take now was a touch. She dressed in silence, a sharp navy suit replacing her usual soft sweaters. Her reflection in the mirror looked almost unfamiliar, confident, composed, untouchable. The woman who had been humiliated in front of a room full of guests was gone. In her place stood someone who had learned how to wield humiliation like a blade. Thomas stumbled into the kitchen half an hour later, bleary-eyed and irritable. "You're up early," he muttered, pouring himself coffee. "I have a breakfast meeting," Karen replied calmly. "Board members from your favorite investors firm. They wanted my perspective on the merger presentation." He froze. "My presentation?" She smiled faintly. "Yes, apparently they've been hearing concerns." His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Pride was his shield, it always had been. By noon, Thomas was at the firm's headquarters, standing before a room of expectant faces. The deal, his supposed salvation, was ready to be signed. Investors, partners, even his mother had gathered to witness the triumph he had promised them. Karen, meanwhile, was seated 2 rows behind, immaculate, poised, her legs crossed, her leather notebook resting in her lap. As the presentation began, she barely listened to the familiar words. She already knew the script. What mattered was the moment, the exact moment when that one, crucial discrepancy she had found would surface. It came halfway through. One of the senior analysts raised a hand, flipping through the same documents Karen had quietly leaked 2 nights ago. "Mr. Reed," the analyst said slowly, "can you explain this projection gap? These numbers don't align with the contractual clause outlined here." Thomas blinked. There must be a mistake, that clause. But the analyst was already shaking his head. "We verified it this morning. If the clause stands, this merger exposes the firm to a substantial loss." A murmur swept through the room. Investors exchanged sharp glances. His mother's hand flew to her pearls. Thomas looked over his shoulder. Whether by instinct or suspicion, Karen couldn't tell, but their eyes met for a fraction of a second. She didn't flinch. She didn't even smile. She simply tilted her head as if to say, "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" A performance. The deal collapsed within the hour. Phones buzzed with frantic calls. Partners left with stiff handshakes and colder words. By the time the boardroom emptied, Thomas was packing like a caged animal. "You knew," he hissed at her when they were finally alone. "I suspected," she corrected softly. "I tried to warn you, remember, but you were too busy giving gifts." His face flushed crimson. "You think this makes you strong? You've destroyed my credibility." "No, Thomas," her voice cut like glass. "You destroyed yourself. I just stopped cleaning up after you." That night, while he drowned his frustration in another glass of whiskey, Karen sent her final message to his mother. A calm, measured letter outlining the risks Thomas had taken, the warning signs he had ignored, and a simple, devastating truth. "You asked for a gift that night, the gift of my departure. I accepted it. Now you and your son can enjoy exactly what you wished for, a world without me to stabilize it." She left the keys on the table, packed her suitcase, and walked out into the rain. Not in tears, not in rage, just steady, deliberate steps toward the cab that waited. In the weeks that followed, the narrative shifted. The story in the city was the divorce that humiliated the wife. It became the wife who left with her dignity intact while her husband's empire crumbled. Karen's social media presence bloomed. The consultancy firm she had quietly aligned with offered her a position, strategic partnerships director. Investors who had doubted her now sought her opinion. Even old friends who had once pitied her now admired her. Thomas tried to call, of course. At first with anger, then with pleading, then with silence. She didn't block him. She just never answered. One afternoon, a month after her departure, she received an unexpected bouquet of lilies, his mother's favorite. The card read, "I misjudged you. I see that now." Karen placed the flowers in a vase, then set them by the window. She felt no triumph, only clarity. Revenge wasn't about watching someone burn. It was about reclaiming the air they once stole from you. And in that reclaimed air, Karen finally breathed.